I stood there in shock. For a moment, at least. It was unbelievable, totally unexpected. I thought, oh, wow, that much gold. What am I going to do? Jerusalem has been a city wrapped in stone and myth for thousands of years. Under its narrow, winding streets and its ancient walls are layers and layers of history, stacked upon one another like uncompleted chapters in a huge book. At its center is the city of David, a tiny ridge said to be the birthplace of Israel's most legendary king. King David, according to Bible, seized his fortress, made it his capital city, and constructed a palace that was a seat of authority. For centuries, however, archaeologists questioned whether this was fact or mere legend, an inspiring myth for a people scattered far and wide. Dig after dig produced remnants, walls, pottery, tunnels, but never a palace. Others concluded that David was no great king, but only a tribal leader who governed a glorified village. Then appeared Dr. Eilat Mazar, born of a renowned line of archaeologists. She bucked scholarly convention. While others derided the Bible as myth, she believed it to be a guide, a map to truth. Her calling was not just to discover artifacts. She wanted to demonstrate that the narratives in the Bible were based on actual history, that they had flesh, blood, and stone to back them up. In her last days before dying in 2021, she uncovered a courageous conviction. She believed that she had discovered the remains of King David's palace, enormous walls, clay seals bearing biblical names, and a fortress that correlated with the Scripture's description. To others, she was a dreamer chasing shadows. To some, a visionary. But what she revealed might be the nearest anyone has ever come to finally unearthing the truth. Eilat Mazar's enthusiasm started many years before she ever laid a trowel on the ground. Born in Jerusalem in 1956, she was raised amidst history, not only in the landscape of her city, but at the dinner table of her family. Her grandfather, Benjamin Mazar, was Israel's most eminent archaeologist, whose innovative excavations close to the Temple Mount influenced modern Israeli archaeology. For Eilat, history was not merely a subject. It was a family tradition. She became captivated by the Bible at an early age. While most kids viewed David, Goliath, or Solomon's temple stories as fables, she considered them historical accounts to be substantiated. These accounts held secrets to her eyes, geographical clues, architectural references, and subtle facts that could guide her to actual sites hidden under Jerusalem. As a student, it was evident that she would take after her grandfather, although her approach was different. Most scholars demanded that archaeology had to be based solely on material remains, independent of faith or scripture, but not Eilat. She was convinced that the Bible was not merely spiritual text. It was a historical document, equal in worth to Egyptian inscriptions or Assyrian tablets. To disregard it was to dismiss one of the greatest historical sources of the ancient Near East. Her opinions won her friends and detractors. Some wrote her off as naive in the lecture rooms, but on site, she was indefatigable. Archaeology was not a job to her. It was a crusade to bring together scripture and rock. Her attention centered on one person, King David. Eilat thought that establishing David's kingdom as real would establish that the Bible's grand stories were grounded in history, not fantasy. She wasn't looking for small answers. She was looking for the palace, the pulse of David's kingdom. If she could find that, it would be one of the greatest finds of the contemporary world. Others had attempted and succeeded only in failure. But Eilat possessed something they did not, unwavering belief that the Bible itself contained instructions. She went there on a quest, and that brought her to the city of David, a thin ridge south of Jerusalem's old city, now dominated by the Dome of the Rock and the Ottoman walls. But in David's day, circa 10th century BCE, that ridge was Jerusalem. Scripture indicates it was a Jebusite fortress that was believed to be unconquerable. The inhabitants jeered David's army, telling them even the lame and the blind could defend it. But David's troops found a hidden water shaft from Gibeon spring into the city, and by that underground route, they captured the fortress. Ever since, it was called the City of David, the birthplace of a kingdom. For archaeologists, the City of David has been a magnet. In the 19th century, British explorer Charles Warren tunneled through its bedrock, uncovering what became known as Warren Shaft, the first real glimpse into ancient Jerusalem. A century later, Renowned archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon excavated the same ridge and concluded that Jerusalem in David's time was nothing more than a small village, no palace, no great kingdom. Benjamin Mazar, the grandfather of Eilat, did excavations close to the Temple Mount and recovered outstanding artifacts, but never found a palace itself. By the early 2000s, all scholars were agreed. If David had lived, he was a small chieftain, and his kingdom was a gross exaggeration. But Eilat wouldn't have it. She thought that the issue wasn't that David's palace didn't exist, but that scholars had been looking in the wrong place. The real truth, she felt, was hiding in plain sight, entombed in the same ridge on which the tale began. The city of David still had its secrets, and she was hell-bent on unearthing them. Archaeologists excavated the city of David for years to no avail. Theories fell apart. Diggings came to a standstill, and the majority gave up. But not Eilat Mazar. Her beacon of hope was an inscription, or a witness, a shard. It was a line of the Bible. In the second book of Samuel 5:11, and Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees and carpenters and masons, and they built David a house. To Mazar, it was no poetic license. It was a blueprint. The verse taught three important facts. The palace was constructed of Phoenician cedar from foreign workers, and important enough to have been mentioned in Israel's central historical book. Tyrian architects would never have erected a humble hut on a village slope. They would have created a magnificent royal palace. One verse made Eilat Mazar believe in King David's palace, and that it was glorious. Eilat Mazar's initial question was one of location. Where within the city of David might there be room for such a large building? To her, the location was self-evident. It would sit on the city's highest and most secure spot, commanding the view below. It was the promontory joining the city of David with the Temple Mount. There loomed the stepped stone structure, a huge man-made platform carved into the hillside from huge blocks of stone. Archaeologists had argued about its function for centuries. Some believed it was nothing more than a retaining wall, others that it was a fortress foundation, but the Bible described a great supporting structure known as the Millo, defended by David and Solomon. Mazar came to believe that the stepped stone structure and the Millo were identical. If she was correct, then David's palace would once have stood right on top of it. Her colleagues were critical. They cautioned her against relying too heavily on the Bible or letting faith get in the way of science. But Mazar felt that the scriptures, interpreted as historical texts, could be leading to hidden truth. In 2005, she went ahead and tested her hypothesis. She sought permission to dig at the summit of the stepped stone structure, a notion that many archaeologists ridiculed. Did she stand a chance of uncovering David's palace from one verse? Not fazed, she organized her team and started digging. Summer in Jerusalem was brutal, the sun beating down on the dry air, the stones hot, but Mazar and her team persisted. They camped on the northern outskirts of the city of David, overlooking the immense terrace of rock that had stumped scholars for centuries. Mazar felt as if she were on the verge of history. The excavation was laborious and tedious. Rubble layers and centuries of fallen houses had to be removed stone by stone, pot shard by pot shard. Then, under the dust, the thick walls started coming out, walls constructed of huge, well-cut stones unlike the ones used in regular houses. Dating the site was reduced to pottery, whose fashion changed with the centuries. The pieces found here were consistent with the Iron Age, approximately the 10th century BCE, the time of King David. Whoever constructed those walls had money, authority, and skilled artisans. But Mazar realized she required evidence more than grandeur. Jerusalem had been reconstructed numerous times. The building could have been built by another king. But she felt she was near something remarkable. As excavation proceeded, the magnitude of the discovery mounted. The structure was colossal, its stones well cut, some weighing as much as tons, its foundation stretching over the ridge. This was no palace of a village. It was a royal structure. Mazar referred to it as the large stone structure. To her, it was a king's palace, the one of 2 Samuel. Pottery from corresponding layers was dated exactly to the 10th century BCE, the era of David and Solomon. Even cynics grudgingly acknowledged the find as stunning. If Jerusalem boasted such massive architecture at the time, Jerusalem was no tribal outpost, but an actual capital, a political and administrative hub that corroborated the biblical record of a united kingdom. Yet still, debate erupted. Without a David inscription, many claimed the linkage was speculative. Then followed the smaller, surprise and discoveries. Ancient seals or bully, imprinted with the names of biblical characters. These connected scripture to the stones and blurred myth and history. To Mazar, the evidence presented a cohesive picture. The stepped stone structure below the palace congrat with the biblical Millo, a stronghold base said to have been fortified by David. The palace above and a huge terrace below were components of one large complex, the fortress and palace of Israel's best-known king. Strategically and symbolically, it was absolutely correct. The find made headlines worldwide. Tourists swarmed the site, envisioning David's palace hidden underfoot. But scholars were skeptical. Some contended the structure was a subsequent fortress or warehouse. The pottery, they said, could belong a century or two later. Critics scoffed at the biblical link as exaggeration. The seals, they pointed out, belonged to servants of subsequent Judean kings, establishing the site's ongoing usage, but not of its original master. Mazar responded with assurance. The pottery and stratigraphy indicated decisively the 10th century. The subsequent seals, she contended, merely indicated that the palace continued to function across generations, precisely the kind of thing one would expect of a royal complex. Her conclusions rekindled one of the oldest controversies of archaeology. Was David a legendary chieftain or a real king of a dominant kingdom? Mazar's book changed the debate. No longer was the question whether David existed, but how magnificent was his reign. By 2010, she'd uncovered even more evidence, a massive 10th century fortification wall and gate north of the city of David. Its stones were monumental, its design sophisticated, suggesting a centralized authority. For Mazar, this confirmed that Jerusalem in David's time was indeed a fortified capital, not a small village. Her last years saw fresh interpretations. Rereading the Ginn, Spring, and Warren Shaft, she maintained that David's conquest of Jerusalem, modeled in the Bible as entering through the water shaft, was not myth but strategy. The water system itself, she thought, was the fortress of Zion. Whoever controlled it controlled the city. When Dr. Eilat Mazar died in 2021, she left behind something more than excavation reports. She left a vision. Through her finds, the large stone structure, the seals, the fortification walls, and her risky interpretations of Scripture, she rewrote Jerusalem's ancient history. Whether or not she actually discovered David's palace is questioned, but she made it so the city of David would never be written off as myth again. Mazar's legacy is one of belief, that religion and science, together with grit and wonder, can animate the past. Maybe archaeology will never uncover a stone inscribed with the phrase, "This is the palace of King David." But her finds brought us nearer to that reality than anyone previously. Under the stones in Jerusalem, the ghosts of an ancient kingdom still breathe, and thanks to Eilat Mazar, the world is still listening.